Hey there. Welcome to this month's episode of the Fraternus Forge podcast. My name is Matthew. I'm your host. Our featured guest this month is Alec Medlin. Alec is a financial advisor with the Knights of Columbus here in Nashville. He does work for families around the area in planning for retirement, 401ks, IRAs, life insurance. Very wise individual, also very charismatic. He carries himself as someone a lot older than his actual age. I think he's like early 20s, like 24, 25. Alec, shoot me a text. Let me know how old you are. But yeah, very, very excited to have him on the podcast. This is actually part one of a two-part series where we look at what it means to be authentically masculine within the confines of our Catholic faith. And then the next episode, which will come out December 1st, we'll look at what it means to be authentically feminine within the lens of our Catholic faith. We spend a lot of time building the framework of what it means, like the definition of masculinity, the different aspects of what it means to emulate Christ, to put ourselves out there for our friends, our family, our community, to sacrifice, to see that bigger picture and set a vision and chart a course for those that we love. We also spend some time sort of debunking shallower forms of masculinity that are presented to us in music and other forms of media, looking at some of the pitfalls that might be in our way as we try to cultivate authentic masculinity in our lives. So yeah, this was a really fruitful conversation. I was very happy to be part of it. Definitely going to be applying some of this stuff in my day-to-day life, and I hope it's useful to you as well. Also, if you have ideas for the future of this podcast, topics that you want to hear us cover, guests that you want to see featured, you can have a question like that is sort of bugging you or something you're wondering in your day-to-day life. It could be anything. Like you could literally send me a message and say, Matt, where do babies come from? We might do a podcast on it. I'm serious. I would love these episodes to be a resource to you and something that is useful to you. And the best way to do that is for you to send me questions like, hey, Matt, this is something that I'm wondering. So please send those my way. If you're in the broader GroupMe DM with all the other young adults here in town, you can send those directly to me. If you're not, or if you just prefer email, you can send those to fraternusforge@gmail.com. That is the best way to get in touch with me. It is the name of the podcast @gmail.com. Send me those ideas. I would love to hear from you. Lastly, make sure you stick around to the end of the episode. There's a little funny outtake that I included. My house, where we recorded this episode, sits under a flight path between Nashville and Fort Campbell out in Clarksville. So there's massive military planes flying over me consistently, like dual rotor helicopters and things like that. And so you'll hear a couple of them during the episode. And at one point, Alec and I just kind of like riffed on the helicopters and stuff flying over us, and it turned out to be pretty funny. So I think that's it. Really excited that you're here for this episode. Really excited to share this episode with you. Let's dive into it.
To me, it's where competence and sacrifice come together.
Okay.
And a lot of people talk about sacrifice when they talk about masculinity. Right?
Okay.
We think of the masculine figures in our life as, let's say, strong fathers who work long hours to make sure that their kids get the correct shoes. You know, the big things and the small things. Have food on the table. Make sure that they're not going to be in a position where the kids have to look after them in old age. That's tough. So you have a lot of sacrifice that comes with being away from your own children for your own children. But then I like to add competence in there because a fool who's sacrificing, it almost seems redundant. Like if you're just doing something for the sake of doing it, there's no virtue in that. But going like, hey, I'm diligent in the actions that I'm taking, and I know they're not going to be for the benefit of my present self, but they're going to be to the benefit of my community, my children, and maybe my future self.
Yeah, I know what you mean. It's sort of like a fool. A fool could be someone who spends just hours, or maybe not even hours on a daily basis, working on something, but they are either not good enough at it, or they haven't taken the time to develop those skills, or they're spending their time in the wrong area on the wrong thing. Like
100%. I think that's important because when, and this is due to me not being maybe articulate enough, we take a father who's working really hard to provide for his children, sacrificing his time for an income, but still finding time to be with his children, that would be considered masculine. But somebody who works 90 hours a week and never sees his kids and is never there for them and are never at the soccer practices and is never at dinner, spending time with his children, raising them with virtue and teaching them lessons, we wouldn't consider that masculine. We consider that a workaholic that's working way too hard.
Probably some avoidance going on as well.
Avoidance. And it doesn't matter how competent of, say, a surgeon that guy might be, that behavior as a whole is not masculine. That would not be
considered masculine,
even if he was a competent surgeon.
Right, because there is a point where, so I think competency, a word that I might use in this model is effectiveness. Yeah. So you're sacrificing, and like you can be very competent at being a surgeon, but your role from like a masculinity standpoint is to provide for your family by sacrificing. So even though you're super competent as a surgeon, there is a point where that sacrifice goes too far and you are losing out on quality time with your spouse, with your kids, and the effectiveness probably becomes either neutral or a net negative because daddy's not home.
Right, he's not there.
Right.
One, and this may just be a personal way that I see life.
Sure,
but maybe there's a few people out there that would, they would affirm that they think this way. I think of my life like a set of scoreboards or a set of buckets that I get to fill.
Okay.
And every day, I can put a little bit into every bucket, a lot of it into one bucket. I get to spread out my time and my energy in a certain way. Okay. And my goal is to be net positive every day. So one of these buckets might be my family's relationships. So I spend time with my parents, with my sisters, my brother. I spend time with them and grow in my relationship towards them. And then another bucket might be my work life, committing myself to excellence in the work that I'm doing. But it's not to the expense of the other bucket. There's always going to be a little bit of an expense, but it's not net negative. Another bucket might be my spiritual life, making sure that I'm taking the time to pray and to think. I'm very self-conscious about being a convert and not being a well-informed Catholic. Right? I work in a job that is exclusively in the service of Catholics. So I spend a lot of time at cathedrals in front of church fathers. I spend a lot of time with Catholic families. Catholicism is basically the center of my life now. And it was something that I didn't even know anything about 5 years ago. If you had asked me who a Catholic was, I would just say, I think they're Christians. And that would have been all I could add to the conversation.
Right.
So that bucket, I want to make sure is filled as much as I can. But I don't, again, want it to be a net negative. I don't want to have to spend so much time working on my spiritual life that I'm taking away from my relationships with my family, my relationship with my friends, my relationship with work. I don't want to spend every moment in a chapel praying because that would be, God. That's not what God wants me to do. Right? God wants me to take my blessed gifts, the abilities that He gave me, to go out in the world and create change in whatever way that's a positive, right? And for me, that's through the work that I do predominantly. I feel more obligation to talk to people about planning.
And it's something that would you say that you're naturally gifted to work in this space? Like, are there natural gifts of yours that lend themselves to working well in this space? Because one of the things that came to mind as we were talking about competency, I think part of it relates to self-knowledge as well. So making that difference in your family's life and making that difference in the world around you begins with knowing where your strengths are. So for example, something my dad used to say to me was like, hey, Matt, if you spent 8 hours a day in the batting cages for the next 10 years, do you think you'd be as good as Barry Bonds? And when I first heard him say that, I was like, yeah, for sure, totally. Absolutely, I'd be as good as Barry Bonds. And he'd be like, okay, cool, let's get you in the batting cage right now because daddy wants a retirement home or something like that.
Right.
But I think his point in saying that was, and it kind of goes back to the idea of the fool, a fool version of me would actually go to the batting cages expecting, like, this is how I'm going to feed my family. Right. But, like, it comes down to that self-knowledge. I don't have that natural gift for athleticism. I'm good at sports, but am I major league good where I'm, like, 0.1% of the players in the world? Does that make sense?
That makes sense. I would say that I'm predispositioned to be decent at what I do. Okay. Because I have a talent for being able to talk to people in a way that lets them open up.
Sure.
That being said, I'm not Barry Bonds.
Sure.
You know what I mean? There are people that are way more naturally charismatic than I am.
Okay.
I feel in life, part of our job in placing ourselves in an occupation or in any calling is figuring out what you're bad at, what you need to run away from, running towards the opposite as a decent track of action, and then figuring out, okay, now that I'm here, what parts of this am I hyper talented at that I can hone? And that's the start, right? I think a lot of people stop there. They go, hey, I'm really good, let's say, with numbers. So they run towards numbers, and they get really, really good at numbers, and they become hyper-specialized, hyper-focused, and maybe even like professor level, hyper-talented. This is their discipline. But then they stay stuck in that one bucket. And they don't expand themselves and go, hey, maybe I'm really good with numbers, but I'm not good with people. So I need to practice and go out of my comfort zone and out of what my natural predisposition is to become more flexible.
Yeah.
And more competent in other areas.
Yes.
But I don't know how that ties in with masculinity exactly.
I think I might have something there. And I think you're onto something. Like, I'll use two sort of threads here and tie it into what you're saying. So, for example, hyperspecialization. And I think something in the masculine brain is like predisposed to
hyperspecialization.
Yeah, to hyperspecialization. Like, I don't know about you, but like, I see the world in black and white sometimes, where it's like, it's either this or it's this. Like, having a definitive answer, it's either a yes or it's no. Right. It's either a positive or a negative. I'm either going all in on this thing or I am never touching it again. And I think there's something in our brains that is wired that way to hyperspecialize. I don't think it's the best strategy, because what you run into is, like, for example, I was spending a lot of time in music at the end of college to up about maybe 1 or 2 years ago. And it sort of has been like this long tail where I spiked and spent a lot of time on it, and it's gradually sort of waned over time. And it was great. It was something that I hadn't done before. I was becoming more flexible and diversifying my skill set. But I also, over time, those marginal returns. So, like, in the beginning, it's all unexplored territory. It's stuff I haven't learned before, like scales, songwriting, lyric composition, and things like that. And I'm learning and discovering all this new territory, and who I am as a person is expanding. Right. But then over time, like, I'm kind of treading the same paths and not really trailblazing as much. So the effort that I'm putting in is yielding less in terms of the space that I'm taking.
Right. Your wholeness as a person.
My wholeness as a person is not growing as much from those contributions. And because I was hyper-specializing, other areas of my life were suffering. Like, my faith was suffering. My friendships were suffering. My vocational discernment was suffering. And, like, dating relationships and stuff like that were all suffering because I was taking too much of my daily time, to go back to your point, and putting it all in the same bucket. Does that track?
That tracks. And I think if I can connect it to God for a moment, and maybe this is a leap, but we can tie these two things together. As Catholics, we all appreciate not just that Jesus is our Lord and Savior, but He's the personification of an ideal. Right? He is the perfect person.
Okay.
As far he's the perfect avatar of God, the perfect part of Him that is human is perfect. So we as Catholics are going to try to strive towards that ideal as fast as possible. And we're never going to get there. Right? It's one of those equations that you can get closer and closer and closer, but you are never going to be Jesus Christ. But how do we run in that direction? How do we become more Christ-like in our lives? Well, first and foremost, and this ties into masculinity, we want to make sure we're ideal husbands. Those are called to be in a marriage and have children. We want to be ideal and take care of our human self. So that involves making sure that we're not, rejecting ourselves by being unhealthy. We want to go to the gym, eat right, all these things. We want to make sure that we're spreading the gospel through friendships and reaching out to other people and helping those people in our communities as efficiently as possible.
Mm-hmm.
All of those things tie into what we would idealize as Jesus, but also in being masculine. None of those things were separate.
Mm-hmm.
So I think to be a masculine man, authentically masculine, would be to try to be as Christ-like as we can in our day-to-day lives through different activities that bring us virtue.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good, I would say, working definition.
Yeah.
Right, off the cuff.
Authentic masculinity is striving to be more Christ-like, since we're looking at this through like a Catholic lens. Right. And I think it's a good place to start, because Christ is the perfect human, born without original sin, did not sin during his time here on earth, did the Father's will perfectly, aligned himself to the Father's will perfectly, sacrificed for those around him, even to the point of shedding his own blood and like breaking his own body on the cross for us, cared for the needy, spread the gospel. So it's like following the example of Christ, you can sort of derive out of that masculine virtue to strive for.
Well, I think it's virtue personified, and masculinity feeds on personifying virtue. Right?
I see. Okay.
Right. So we get the reason that we have, we'll say, to be Catholic is to not be morally flexible.
Sure.
That there are certain unequivocal truths that we believe will lead to not only the best life here on earth, but the best life that leads us to heaven. To live in those values as a man, to the best of our ability, is to be masculine. And that's just through the Catholic lens. I mean, if we want to take it from an agnostic or atheistic lens, we'll just talk about practicality.
Sure.
Nobody can tell me that their life would not be better if they ate better, they worked out more, they worked harder at their job, they spent more diligent time with their wife, they spent more time with their kids, and they wouldn't be more impactful. That's just a practical standpoint. And why is it practical? Because it brings us not just innate joy, we have an innate a drive to do that, but it brings us closer to God, even if you were an atheist. This would be back when I was a teenager, going through those middle school, high school years, I would call myself strongly agnostic.
Okay.
It was because I grew up in a lot of Methodist Protestant churches, and the idea of God, and this is not to say that those churches are lesser in any way. It's still good to get closer to Christ through whatever lens you got, however you can get there. But I wasn't being taught rules alongside the virtues, responsibilities alongside the virtues. I was just being taught God loves you no matter what. You could be an axe murderer till the day you die, but at 5 minutes before you die, you say, Jesus Christ, I accept you into my heart as my Savior. We're good. You go to heaven. Which I don't think many people would be okay with, because that's obviously showing a lack of virtue throughout all of your life. So when I was strongly agnostic, I still closely held the belief that I would bring my kids to church. And it was because of the practical moral lessons that you learned just by osmosis through being around the Christian community as a whole. You learn things like, look after your neighbor, honor thy mother, just broad things that would give you practical effectiveness through my life or through my kids' life. So I would want my kids to go to church even if I didn't believe in God. Now I do. But I think that leads to knowing that you don't have to be stridently Catholic to still be a masculine person. It certainly helps. It certainly gives you much more direction.
Right.
But it's not that means that not everybody who isn't a Catholic just can't be masculine, because it's not true. Right.
Yeah, it's and I appreciate there's so many threads that I want to pull on here, like so much good stuff. I'll first say that I've had a similar experience in the Protestant spaces, and with friends who have fallen away from the faith, who, like, there's the one buddy who's coming to mind. You made sort of the case for, I would bring my kids to Mass strictly, like, even if I was agnostic, I would bring them strictly for the purpose of instilling in them those virtues by osmosis, that, hey, stealing is wrong. Hey, keeping your word is really, really good. Lying is wrong. And I see that with...
It's such a practical vehicle. It's a second authority that my kids can go, hey, Dad he's telling us these things.
Right.
But so are all of these other people. And not
Right.
only these other people, but the Bible and our pastor. Okay.
Right.
I need to investigate this at the very least to see if there's something to chew on here.
And for the record, like, this is a hypothetical scenario where neither of us are Catholic and just trying to instill practical human virtues in our kids' lives. But I think that makes for a really compelling case, because even in the absence, like, let's just ignore God for a second. Let's ignore faith and the afterlife and all that for a second. Even if you ignore those things, the practical application of those virtues is still a net positive, and a big one at that, in most people's lives. So being able to cultivate that is huge.
Right.
And then you add, like you said, like to your point, the faith element to it. It adds additional support, additional buttressing to those ideas. Like, hey, we now have a role model to strive for. And now it's not only...
You've got a straighter line.
Right. And it's not only the material well-being of my children and my spouse and my community in this life, but then it's also, hey, there's an obligation on you to act in this way, not only for their well-being right now, but also for their well-being when they pass. You're fighting for the salvation of their souls, in a way, through your example.
And that brings in more responsibility.
Yeah.
As Catholics, we have a stronger set of values, I believe, because we've got a stronger set of responsibilities. They are intertwined. It's like rights in the Constitution come with responsibilities. You don't get rights without responsibilities. There's a reason that we have God-given rights. To add further fuel to the point, why do we find heroic stories so compelling in media that aren't even just, that have nothing to do with, say, the gospel, right?
Sure.
Every guy worth anything, when he was growing up watching Lord of the Rings and, you know, all these different, you know, heroic stories.
Sure.
Want to be like, man, I want to be in that, right?
Yeah.
And the reason is because you want to be the type of person who would do those hard steps, right? Who would take on so much responsibility and so much strife and so much hardship, and then be able to go, not only am I taking on all of this, let's call it risk, but I'm able to bear it. And that's virtuous, right? To take on my responsibilities and bear them.
And me bearing this, just to add to that, me bearing this risk or making these sacrifices provides for people directly.
Right.
By me bearing this risk, other people thrive. By me bearing this risk, other people don't have to bear that risk. Is that right?
100%.
Okay.
And it's not to take it on whole as a sole person, but also to take it on as a community, right? That the phrase, you know, iron sharpens iron, right? If anybody's ever seen a blacksmith at work, you know, when iron strikes iron, it is not a passive or light undertaking. There's sparks fly. It is metal on metal. It is hot. I think that speaks to not only the hardship that it takes to become a better, more virtuous person and more masculine, but also speaks to the fact that it takes somebody who is strong-willed enough to not only present those virtues wholeheartedly, but to ask you to do the same, to raise your temperature and say, hey, I expect this of you. And there's going to be people that are brittle, and they don't hold up when iron strikes iron, or they crack, and they go, no, it's not for me.
Right.
You know, it's, you know, I'm good. But that's a risk as somebody who is strong in virtue. It's a risk they need to take.
Right, because if you're not there to hold others to that higher standard,
then they won't hold themselves to
then they won't go to it, or they might hold themselves to a standard, but the one that you as their peer hold them to is always going to be higher. Or I think in a lot of cases it's going to be higher. Like, you may be around some friends who are just not a good influence for you. Maybe you're on a higher trajectory than they are, in which case you need to be holding them to that standard.
You need to get out of there if they won't listen. If they're holding you back from being virtuous, then they're not your friends.
I'm reminded right now of a book that I read by a guy named Jack Donovan.
Okay.
It's called The Way of Men. And the framework of masculinity that they use in there, which ties into a lot of what we're talking about here, I think is really solid. So let's think about this model of saying like yes to a risk, or taking on risk. So there's courage. So the ability to look that risk in the face, and in spite of fear, in spite of the potential dangers,
taking it on
and saying yes. That's where it starts. That's the first part of masculinity. Then once you are actually bearing that risk, there's strength. So being able to push, exert force. There's obviously the physical element of that that we work out, like,
but it could be moral strength.
It could be intellectual strength, like, and then mastery, I guess, ties into that as well, where it's, hey, I'm good at this thing. I have competence in this area, and I'm able to stand firm when pushed, navigate, solve problems, things like that, bear the burden well. And then honor is that sort of communal piece where there are other guys around you who are following this code. Some of them are higher, some of them are lower, but being able to stand in that space, lift up those who are on lower rungs and hold them to a higher standard, aspire to higher ones, and then this sort of mutual goodwill is passed among the guys where someone does something that is masculine or exemplifies those virtues, and recognizing that and being like, hey,
what's magnetic?
It's magnetic. Yeah, exactly. So just to play back one more time, courage, strength, mastery, honor is the model that I typically think of.
I like that. Courage, strength, mastery, and honor. How would you, to pull it into a practical sense, let's say there's somebody who is not Catholic. They never grew up in the faith. They know nothing about it. And they're trying to exemplify those virtues. How would you guide that person in the best way that you can? Because I feel like one problem that we have as, we'll say, society at large, as culture at large, is that there are these theories that people are putting out to the world. I'll use strength's an easy one as, say, somebody who's really a bully.
Sure.
Right? They're strong,
right,
but they're not projecting it the right way. Right? I don't like to get very political, but I'll use Donald Trump as an example because everybody knows Donald Trump, right?
Sure.
I don't think every listener would argue with me if I said he may not be the most virtuous person on earth.
I have a problem. No, I'm just kidding.
Right. And part of that is I'm going to go after the little guy mentality that he has from time to time. Or I need to prove something to the world. Rap culture is really heavy in that. I call it my ignorant music. When I'm in the gym, I'm blasting heavy metal, ignorant rap. I mean, it's like borrowed fake masculinity. It's able to get me aggressive enough to push through the tough thing I'm undertaking at the moment. But I don't take that music to heart and then go practice it in the world and be like, man, I need to collect all the money and all the women and I need to project my wealth onto everybody. That would be foolish. Nobody would call that masculine. Right? They wouldn't even call it virtuous. So how would you guide another person in, let's say, your friend group, who may not have that Catholic orientation that we have towards masculinity? Yeah, I would say, so I think the difference between those two, yeah, it's FedEx. Yeah. What's up, FedEx? What up? Let's get, I want to hear the answer to that question, but then we need to get back on track. I feel like we're doing this.
This is good. No, this is good. I think we were off track for a little bit, and I think we found our way back.
Yeah.
But it's fine. Like, it's meant to be a conversation, and if it wanders a little bit, that's fine.
Okay.
I'm also going to cut this part out. No, I'm not. So
what up, FedEx man?
So to answer your question, the key difference between those two spaces. So you've got a friend who's Catholic and a friend who's agnostic, atheist, something like that. And your goal is to inspire these folks to live more virtuous lives, more masculine lives. And I think the key differentiator between those two spaces is motivation. What's driving them? So with a Catholic friend, it's everything that you would say to your atheist agnostic friend, which we'll get to in a second, plus, hey, this is what we're expected to do as Catholic men. If you are truly living in accordance with like the dictates of your faith, you're supposed to be more like Christ. And to be Christ is to be masculine in like the healthiest, holiest way possible. And there's all sorts of spiritual, eternal implications of following that. That's where I would start with a Catholic friend. But with an agnostic friend, you don't get to play the faith card on them. And so let's say that you've got a buddy let's say that, like, instead of making it a really easy equation where he's just like sitting on the couch covered in Cheeto dust playing like Call of Duty all day.
Right. This is a person who is actively interested in striving towards virtue and masculinity, but is not
hitting the bullseye.
Yes.
Is not hitting the bullseye. So like, let's say that you have someone like your Donald Trump type who's over-indexing on strength. Most likely they are exhibiting traits of selfishness, where it's like, how do I get as much stuff for myself as I can? Mm-hmm. And my argument there would be like, listen, man, you can have all of the money in the world, and like you can do
God
really
wants
well
you to
for
live
yourself.
abundantly. Don't worry.
Right. And there's a point, and I think I've heard this statistic before. The number might have shifted since I heard it, but marginal happiness does not increase once somebody makes over $80,000 a year. Like, the difference between making 80 and 180 or 180 and 280 is so small. Like, what are you going to do with that? Like, you have a home, you have the ability to go places if you want to, you have food in the fridge, I assume.
Right. I'll often ask my client, whose side do you think I'm on? Mm-hmm. Who do you think I'm advocating for here? And more often than not, I say, well, you're on my side, but I still agree with you. And I'll say, no, I'm not on your side. I'm on the side of the future self, the future you. I'm not on your side right now. What I'm asking you to do today is hard. I'm asking you to sacrifice right now to do something you do not want to do. You're giving up the now so that the person in the future has abundance, has more. And there's a balance to that. I never go into somebody's house and say, you need to take everything you have and give it up for your future self. Because that's not true. But the other extreme is, I'm not going to say I'm not going to have life insurance. I'm not going to invest. I'm not going to buy a home. I'm not going to do all these things that are difficult, because then the future self is going to suffer, and your family is going to suffer, and your community by extension is going to suffer.
Yep.
So when I sit across from somebody who may not be, and I've got some people in my life who are broadly virtuous but aren't religious, the way that I try to lead them is not only by example, but by telling him, like, look, you're making decisions as your present self, like he's the only person that matters. There are several other people in this equation that matter. Your past self matters a lot, and your future self matters probably more, because one day you're going to be him, and you're going to have to sleep at night with the decisions that you made now. So whatever that ends up being, however you want to take that, that's your journey. If that means, if you feel in your heart of hearts that you could be healthier, and that's the place in your life that you know that you need to strive to be better in, well, you already know the answer. You just might not want to do it. That's cowardice. That's being lazy. That's sloth, right? And I might call it sloth to somebody who understands biblical analogies, but to my friend who doesn't,
it's laziness.
I'll just call it laziness and say, hey, that's you being scared or being a coward or being lazy. And it's my job to tell him that, because we all have that conversation with ourselves all the time, every day, and know there are places in our life that we could be better. But it takes an outside example or outside source sometimes to go, hey, I'm calling your bull. I'm calling you out and saying, hey, you could be better than what you are now. And that's a great thing. I mean, imagine how awful your life would be if this is as good as you can get.
Like you just hit a ceiling.
Yeah, you just hit a ceiling. It's like, all right, I'm done.
Yeah.
I couldn't be any more virtuous.
Right.
How awful would that feel? You know?
Right.
I mean, there's a reason that guys work out for 20, 25 years and still do it.
Yeah.
I mean,
because there's no ceiling.
There's no ceiling on that.
Right.
They're going to go, hey, it makes me feel good. It helps my health. My heart feels great. I have a lot of energy. I'm getting
got
more
those
muscular.
endorphins. Yeah,
got those endorphins. And I use workout because everybody can understand that.
Right.
But if you had a ceiling on masculinity or you had a ceiling on heroic virtue, that would be awful.
I really like a lot of the ideas that we're sort of playing with right now.
Right.
And
we're chewing on it. This is us chewing the fat.
Yeah. And I think, so like we talked a little bit earlier about there's sort of the framework of those masculine virtues like strength, honor, courage, mastery. But then what we're focusing on now and what we're really drilling into now is this idea of sacrifice. And I really like the lens of there's a future iteration of me that is going to have to live with the choices that I make today. And if I make poor choices today, that future version of me and the future versions of my community, the future versions of my family are going to suffer if I choose poorly today. Yeah. And poor choices can look like the selfishness model that we were talking about. Like, I might be alone in 40 years. If I focus too much on money and focus too much on that selfishness piece, I might not open myself to my family. Then my wife or my potential spouse is alone. My children never come into the world, and all I've got to show for it is a pile of cash. Like, yay me. There's tons of other examples, but I really like that model a lot.
It's entirely functional. Like, I wouldn't say it's the best model, but it's entirely functional, because then you can say, look, I will suffer more in the long run. My future self, my future generations will suffer more if I don't do anything. The opportunity cost of not getting better is always so much higher than the cost of taking action today. Right? The problems that will come in the future that I will have to deal with are always so much higher than just getting your butt up and going to the gym.
Right.
You know? We all know how abundantly true and necessary virtue is, because it's not only coming from a God responsibility perspective, but from a functional selfish perspective. You know that you're going to end up worse off if you don't take action, and you don't force the people you love to take action to become better.
Have you met Whit Smith over at St. Anne's?
I have not met Whit.
He's real solid human. Hey, Whit, if you're listening. So he and
a good dude.
Good dude. Hey, Mr. Dude.
If I made her that's something. Okay, Mariah, she's pointed out that I say "good dude" too much.
Good dude.
Whenever somebody mentions, it's like, "Hey, have you met Whit?" No, but he sounds like a good dude. But I say everybody's a good dude. Apparently, it's lost all meaning. So I need to change up.
You need to control the currency of good dude.
Yeah, good dude has been inflated.
I mean, the inflation rate on good dude is like
straight
80%.
Venezuelan. It's just it's tough.
Your good dude currency is about to collapse.
Oh.
It's about to mean nothing.
It has.
It's already a fiat currency.
Can I change it for gold? Hold my hand out. So yeah, I didn't mean to cut you off. But.
No, you're good. You're good. I really like this idea. I've got two sort of thoughts here. So one is the example of Whit. You mentioned forcing those you love to do things that are going to be good for them in the long run, and I feel like as fathers especially, that's a service that we owe to our children, that we've said yes, we were courageous and we said yes to the potential for having kids, and now we're exerting strength and mastery in the rearing of those children and sacrificing in this equation. Whit mentioned that his kids like don't want to brush their teeth at night, just don't want to do it. Now, if he doesn't sacrifice, the sacrifice being I'm going to risk a potential, I don't know, disagreement or yelling match with my kids.
My kids aren't going to like me as much. They won't come to me with problems when I'm just 1,000 things.
Right.
My relationship broadly.
Right, exactly. I'm going to risk that discomfort here in the moment because I know future iterations of my children are going to be way worse off if they don't have a functioning set of teeth. Like that's the trade-off that we got to be making.
I think it's an entirely masculine equation.
Yeah.
Because to say the effeminate side of the family dynamic, or a feminine side, not effeminate, a feminine side of that family dynamic is the nurturer, right? So it's our job as fathers and as men to challenge our kids to be better and to do hard things and to do things we don't want to do, and to give them support that way and love through that lens.
Hold them to that higher standard. So that our spouse can follow up in the rear and say, you know, I'm here to support you and show you love, and to, you know, on those hard days where you know, you failed the test, you did your best, but it just wasn't good enough. To be that other loving hand, the other side of that coin, and say like, it's okay. What's mattered is that you tried your best. You know, And both spouses can function in both roles.
Right. There is overlap 100%.
Yes.
But I feel like the strongest nurturing men will never be as strong nurturers as the strongest nurturing women.
And vice versa.
And vice versa.
Right.
So part of the strive to be masculine and excellent in our masculinity is to try to be on the extreme of masculine fatherhood.
Yes.
To go, I'm going to hold my kids to the highest standard. They're still going to be loved. I'm not going to be the tiger parent that says you're going to spend 14 hours a day doing the
brushing
piano,
your teeth. Yeah.
Because that's not virtuous. That's obviously Strawman there, but it's our jobs to balance out the extreme nurturing side that we want from our spouse. So we're failing in our own duty if we aren't providing that. Again, the opportunity costs are too high. You have to be excellent. You don't have a choice.
Right. Because, like you said, the downside of not pursuing that excellence is far too great. Yeah.
And we innately know that. I mean, it's not something that you have to be taught. You've seen every kid got punished, right? You know, you see the people in your community, your family, who are maybe falling off the wagon a little bit, and you innately know, I don't want to be like that. I don't want to be like them. I don't want those consequences. Selfishly, I don't want those consequences.
Yes.
It doesn't have to be selfish, but that's keeping in the lens of, without God. Selfishly, I don't want to be like them or like him or her. So you have to go, oh crap. I got to get off my ass. Right.
Yeah.
Got to get off my butt.
Yeah. I love that you used the idea of consequences, because for me, that's one of the primary reasons why I go to the gym. That's one of the primary reasons why I exercise, because I have seen multiple members of my extended family struggle with diabetes, weight problems, all sorts of medical conditions that could have been avoided if they exercised more. And like, yes, I want all of the other benefits, like looking better, fitting into my clothes well. I want to feel good on a day-to-day basis and have the energy to do stuff. But a big motivator for me is I don't want to be in the hospital when I'm like 50 or 60
You've seen the consequences.
With arterial plaque because I didn't eat right or didn't exercise.
I think we as humans have a terrible problem. That problem is we underestimate the chances of bad things happening and the impact of those bad things. We see it all the time. I see it in my work life all the time, where people won't save $50 a month for their retirement. Hate to break it to everybody, but $50 is nothing. That won't even solve the problem. That's not even a Band-Aid for retirement. So I might see a family who for $12 a month, $100 a year, they can make sure if God forbid something happens to them in life that their spouse and kids are going to be okay. They underestimate the chances of that happening, and they overemphasize the importance of the present, so they don't make that decision to go, hey, I'm going to make sure my kids are going to be okay. It's not they don't love their kids. It has nothing to do with that. It's just that they're not even aware of the risk. They're not even aware of that being a problem. They're not actively thinking about it because we put those bad thoughts aside all the time. We don't want to think about them, so we don't.
Overvaluing and overemphasizing the present.
Right.
In spite of potential knowledge of those consequences. It's like, well, yeah.
But I'm just going to bury my head in the sand.
Right, exactly. Or that's not going to happen to me. Like, they were eating pizza every day. I'm just eating Lucky Charms every day. Cereal's way healthier than pizza.
And I'm only eating the marshmallows. I mean, I'm not even eating half the cereal.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. I know we've talked about Jordan Peterson a little bit before, and he has one of the bits in his book that I really love is pursue that which is meaningful, not what is expedient. And it's the same thing that you're saying. Expediency is like now over everything else. Consequences be damned. I am optimizing for this current iteration of me versus that which is meaningful takes into account the big picture. And I feel like that's another thing as men that we're called to. So we have the virtues that we listed before: strength, mastery, courage, honor. We have sacrifice, but then there's also direction. Being able to see that big picture, see the potential for consequences as well as upside, and then set a course, set that direction, and rally those around us in that direction. That could be friends, that could be family, that could be community. being able to see that big picture and say like, okay, if we're really going to optimize for what is best for all of us over the long term, we need to head in this direction.
All boats rise with the tide.
Mm-hmm.
And also, all fall with the tide.
Mm-hmm.
It's important to remember the other side of that.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's one reason I love working exclusively with Catholic families,
Mm-hmm.
is that I get to see my tide, all my boats rise with that tide. And go, oh, not only am I working in the community and helping people with financial planning, but I get to see the direct result of that almost every day.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And that's really, I mean, it feels so good.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing that beats that.
Mm-hmm.
It's like I don't have kids, but I think it feels maybe similar to seeing your kid like get that home run,
Right,
ace that thing they worked really hard on.
right.
It's just, we just feel so ingratiated. It's not the right word, but we feel so grateful
Mm-hmm.
that we had that positive impact, and it almost reinforces our mission and gets us to go just that bit farther.
Yeah.
And gets us to go like, oh crap, like
Yeah.
I'm right.
Mm-hmm.
Like this is what God wants me to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm seeing the positive impacts in this world.
Mm-hmm.
Man, let's do that again.
Yeah. It's like, I really like this thread that we're on of like expediency versus sacrificing for the future, and this idea of just having that sense that you're in the right place at the right time doing the right thing when you've showed up in a place where courage was needed, strength and mastery were needed. There were people around you, be they friends, family, community, that mattered to you. You showed up for them, and you get to see the direct benefit of your actions in their lives and yours. That feeling of just satisfaction hits, where it's like, wow, I really am doing something that matters.
It's worthwhile.
And I think we need to pay attention to that. I think those are really helpful cues.
It's one of the reasons young men are just starved for purpose and a way to experience that.
Mm-hmm.
It's like with this the new Top Gun movie that just came out. When the first one came out, that was such a great recruiting tool for the Army and the Navy. Mm-hmm. They threw out recruitment tables in front of these movie theaters because there were men that went to see this movie that they were just like, oh, it's just going to be an action movie. And then they saw everything they wished they could be. Mm-hmm. Not only that, they went, I hunger for an opportunity to be like that. Mm-hmm. So when they left the theater, they were all hyped up. I mean, there'd be a Navy table right outside talking to them about service. Mm-hmm. Like, here's an opportunity for you to sacrifice for your community and your country. Mm-hmm. An opportunity for you to provide for yourself and your family, give yourself a good retirement, take care of those in your immediate community, mm-hmm. travel the world. I mean, it's a pretty good gig for somebody who's 21 years old, 19 mm-hmm. years old, going, I don't know what I'm going to do with my life. Mm-hmm. Right? Mm-hmm. It's a great outlet. We saw that with 9/11 too, mm-hmm. where once that happened, it was a tragedy. Mm-hmm. Enrollment rates for the military spiked. Enlistment mm-hmm. rates, I should say, for the military spiked because people went, that's awful. I don't want that to ever happen again. Mm-hmm. How can I be a part of the solution? How can I go out there and serve and give back? It became very real how much, mm-hmm. it became very real how disassociated from sacrifice some people felt. Mm-hmm. Oh, I want that. Mm-hmm. It's weird to say, but sacrifice is compelling. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Very weird to say.
It is
like
weird.
It would be the opposite.
It is weird. I feel like the main reason it's weird is that it's uncomfortable, and often profoundly so, mm-hmm. and yet it's so compelling to like put ourselves in harm's way or endure pain for the benefit of others is compelling. I feel like we've covered some really good ground here in terms of like defining some of the things that masculinity is. And you know me, I'm a big action guy, and I know you are too. For the guys listening to this podcast, how do we as men identify those gaps and identify those places where we need to grow, where who we are is not really in line with the hero that we see depicted in movies? What are some of the cues that we might watch for?
Pay attention to the things you don't want to think about. Mm-hmm. If you're not thinking about it, that's an alert in your head that goes, I need to think about it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? The last thing somebody wants to do when, let's say, a family member passes away is go, oh, I want to think about that all the time.
Mm.
But it's necessary to sort of process, why am I thinking like this? Is, oh, okay, I'm thinking of it because of X, Y, and Z. Well, it's quite obvious why I'm thinking about it, but like, why am I grieving in this way? Or why am I, I think you had a podcast with Sawyer about this that was fantastic. Mm-hmm. Why am I not thinking a certain way?
Mm-hmm.
Why is this keeping me from doing X, Y, and Z? Especially when you notice something keeping you from working in the other areas of your life. You have to pay attention to it.
Mm-hmm.
Most people know what they need to work on.
Mm.
Most people aren't going, yep, I got everything figured out, but my life still sucks.
Mm-hmm.
Much more often than somebody says, man, my life sucks. But I can't do anything about it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which I would just say, no, it's not that you can't do anything about it. You're just not willing to do the things it takes to fix it.
You're choosing to not do anything about it.
Not doing anything about it. Inaction is a choice. It's never passive.
Right.
We convince ourselves that passivity is not deciding yet or not choosing a direction to go. Mm-hmm. No, it's just accepting the opportunity costs. Mm-hmm. It's a decision. Mm-hmm. You do not have the luxury in this life to not make a decision. Mm-hmm. You have to. Mm-hmm. Whether you do something or not, that is a decision.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. And so paying attention to the areas that we're not thinking about or focusing in on those and exploring them more. What are some factors that might cause us to not look in an area? Like, I assume fear is one of them.
Oh, yeah.
Potential for discomfort is another one.
Discomfort, fear of failure, fear of people judging you for considering something or for doing something. Mm-hmm. The consequences of failure. Mm-hmm. I mean, it all has to do with a feeling of inadequacy, I would say, at the end of the day. Feeling like maybe I'm not good enough, or I'll get safer first before I do this. Like, I'm going to go back to lifting. I'm going to get stronger first and put on another 10 pounds before I enter this weightlifting competition, because then I'll be more prepared. Mm-hmm. And then you get to that point and go, okay, well, I'll be okay. Like, I'll compete, but I'm not going to place first. So, why don't I get a little stronger and then I'll do this thing, right? It's constantly keeping the ball, pushing it down the road. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Which, I mean, people just don't make the decision, or if they do, it's far too late. Mm-hmm. So
fear, like there's sort of a couple different cues that you can pay attention to. There's the desire element, which we talked about earlier, like that hunger for purpose that we sometimes feel sparked when we meet somebody who's really exemplifying masculine virtues. Mm-hmm. We see them depicted in a movie, but then there's also this avoiding fear angle where it's, I'm choosing to put this thing off. I'm choosing to ignore this thing. And I feel like some of that plays into the honor element as well, because like before you can grow, you kind of have to admit where you are.
Right.
And you have to know where you are.
You got to go, man, I kind of suck.
Right. And that might be what keeps somebody out of the gym in the first place, because they don't want to see how weak they are. I'm sure that did it for me for a very long time with competitive sports. Like, I'm not good at most sports. I can do baseball, but like basketball, forget it. And that is what has kept me out of that ring, like out of that space for a long time, because I don't like when people, especially other men who I respect, get to see me be bad at something. I hate it.
That's, to put it another way, like, I've got a really good habit of asking stupid questions to people.
Same.
And I say it's a good habit because once you know the answer to a stupid question, guess what? You never have to ask it again. Mm-hmm. And then eventually you're not stupid anymore. Mm-hmm. So you can just keep doing that forever and it'll work out for you. I feel like we as guys have ego. It gets in the way a lot. Mm-hmm. Fear of failure, fear of not being as good as we could be. Mm-hmm. Going, hey, the ideal is so far away. So like, what's even the point? Mm-hmm. I mean, there's all kinds of little demons that you get in your head. Mm-hmm. Where it can keep you from making the correct decisions at the time. When somebody really close to me is having an issue, my go-to advice with every one of them is make the next best move. Mm-hmm. Always just you don't have to make the right move. Just make your next best one. Mm-hmm. And if you keep doing that, eventually you're going to be in a better spot. So I feel as guys, it's really important for us to practice our masculinity and our bravery and strength by doing our next best move. It doesn't have to be right, but do it. And to hold others to the same standard. To go, it's okay. Like, you're going to fail. Like, I fail all the time.
You're going to scuff your knees.
You're going to scuff your knees. You're going to insult somebody on accident. You're going to flub a social interaction. Man, if you could count on the back of your hand how many times you have screwed up a social interaction, like, whew,
I need some more hands.
Yeah, you need some more hands. You run out of space quick. I would.
Yeah, that's a really good framework, because as long as you're operating from this place of make the next best move, the pressure is not on you to be perfect. So you don't get locked up in this indecision fear space. And then that also, would you say that it sort of arms you with the mindset to weather the ups and downs of those actions? Like, you might make the next best move and it's, oh sweet, like this girl said yes,
right,
I got the job, whatever. Or you might like, oh, she said no, didn't get the job, stock market tanked, whatever the case might be. Is that fair? It sort of helps you weather those ups and downs as a result of your actions and just keep moving, keep swinging.
Yeah. Right. You have to figure out what your next best move is first before you can do it, right? So it's also not only a call to action, but a way to challenge somebody to think about what their next best move is. And that's I think the important part. More important than just the action, because then you have to go, okay, well, shoot, things suck, or this thing sucks. What do I need to do? What? And then you have that conversation with yourself and with God, and go, okay, like, here, I have all these opportunities in front of me, or all these things I can do to make opportunities happen. What do I need to do? What's my next best course of action? It'll keep you efficient. It'll keep you, as far as a compass goes, it'll keep you pouring as north as you can get.
Yeah.
Once you're lost at sea, it doesn't matter, because it's like, all right, like, based on this, I can do that.
Right. You don't have to figure out every step between you and your destination. No. It's just based on where my North Star is.
What's step one?
What's step one? And
get step
from where
one
I am
done
right now. Yeah.
And then after you finish step one, you're back to step one.
Right. Step one is always the next move.
Step one's always the next move.
Yeah.
It gets you not only to think about what that next efficient step is, but it gets you to think about your right next step. But then it gets you moving towards that overall goal faster. And that can be, okay, I'm looking for a job because my job sucks. And that'd be an easy one. Everybody's running into that problem. Okay, what's my next best move? Is it to get a promotion? Is it to leave entirely? Is it to move to a different city? Is it to change careers? Is it to stick with a passion of mine? Maybe those aren't all the same thing, right? You have to make the next best move. But it doesn't mean not think about the future. That doesn't mean disregard your future self entirely. Just focus on what you got to do next. It means you got to think about that too. And go, okay, where am I trying to go overall? What's going to get me to my overall goal? Okay, what's my next best thing to get there? Figure that out, and then it's actionable.
Yes. This sort of thoughtful action, I think, is at the root of this authentic masculinity model. Thoughtful action, like seeing that bigger picture, seeing potentially the obstacles in front of you that might be blocking you from taking that next best step, and then choosing it in spite of those fears and those obstacles. I think a lesser form of masculinity that I know I've fallen into, and I've seen other guys fall into as well, is this hyperactivity where
if I just stay busy,
something is wrong in here. Something is wrong internally. I'm not choosing to acknowledge something, and I'm going to cover that with busyness, or the machismo that we see some guys sort of adopt as well, where it's like, I'm going to be stoic, or I'm going to bark orders, or talk with this certain sort of tinge in my voice.
It's like a pseudo masculinity.
Right.
It's not authentic. It's not virtuous. One, and this is stolen from somebody else. Man, I couldn't tell you who told me this, but a long time ago, somebody said you got to slow down to speed up. You have to go, okay, I have to consider the consequences of me not taking action. I got to consider the actions that I will be taking, how that will affect me and others. I got to consider all these different externalities and how I'm going to change the world by whatever action I choose to take or don't choose to take. That's tough. So then you got to deal with the cotton between your ears. And man, Nobody wants to do that.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to do that.
Yeah.
And it's not like that. I'll call it like prosperity gospel. It's not like the man, like you can do anything if you just set your mind to it. It's like, no. How about you can do something? Mm-hmm. Everybody wants to change the world, but nobody wants to help their mom do the dishes, right? Like you can do something. Do that next best thing. Start there. Mm-hmm. From that point, do your next best thing. Mm-hmm. Start there. Mm-hmm. Consider the consequences of you not doing anything. Consider the consequences of you doing the thing that you're trying to do. Mm-hmm. Think twice, act once.
Think twice, act once. Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And I've 100% gotten too quick at times. I think everybody could say that. Mm-hmm. And I faltered in a lot of ways when I do that. I don't consider considering. Mm-hmm. I think that's just part of being wise is starting out a fool and being okay to play the fool a little bit and go, I don't know anything. Like, I got a bunch of dumb questions. Mm-hmm. Let me get better by being humble for a second. I think that's masculine, right? Going back to our first little bit about being the fool, you don't want to be the fool. You don't want to always be incompetent, always working in the wrong directions, not working towards correct goals. Mm-hmm. But part of being competent and being wise and being masculine is to go, hey, there's a better version of me that could exist. Mm-hmm. Let me work towards that better version. Mm-hmm. The start of that is not knowing everything. The start of that's not being strong. The start of that is not being maybe even virtuous. Mm-hmm. I remember when I was a little kid, I had a problem with, I would constantly lie about stupid stuff. I know people run into that. Like kids do it all the time. Like, did you eat that candy? No, I didn't eat that candy out of my candy drawer. Totally didn't do that. There's like wrappers in my pockets. Right? So you got to be able to go like, hey, like that Jordan Peterson, start with, if you can't tell the truth, at least don't lie mentality. Mm-hmm. Bring some of that to your life as wise. Going, I got a place I could be. Let me start where I'm at, accept where that is, and work from there. Make the next best move from there. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Man, again, so many good points to sort of like tease out here. One thing that's coming to mind based on that, I totally had it a second ago. What was it?
I'll take your time.
Yeah, it was like,
I'll start going. Warm up my voice.
We're doing sound effect trials in the background.
Doing my warm ups.
If you had actually done that before this started, it would have been like, all right, Alec is going hardcore on this. This is impressive. This is impressive. I feel like I'm watching a Chinese gymnast before the Olympics.
Oh yeah, all seriousness. You can tell we're focused and we're not.
We're so locked in. Yeah. I think the thing that comes to mind, you mentioned being the fool in some of those equations. I think that going back to a point that we made way in the beginning of this episode, this hyper-specialization ideal, that in and of itself could be a protective mindset. Like we said earlier, like I'm choosing to stay in this space because I feel safe here and I feel competent here. But a lot of times, one of the most valuable things that you can bring to yourself, to your friends, to your family, and your community is not, sure, you can be really, really good at one thing, but a diverse array of skills and the flexibility to adapt based on what the situation calls for, I think is infinitely more valuable than like one person who's really, really good at coding. Like, sure, coding is very valuable in today's day and age, but like if that person is missing social skills or
we don't go, man, I want to be, that is my ideal. I just want to be the guy who codes real good.
Right.
Not very few people are like that.
Right.
It's not well-rounded.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And the difference between being in like the 65th versus the 85th percentage of coders is, sure, you probably are going to make more money, but that's about it. Like as we're closing and wrapping up here, are there any other thoughts that you'd want to add to what we sort of shared?
What did we talk about? I think we talked a little bit about striving towards the heroic ideal. And as Catholics, for us, it's easy, right? Strive towards sainthood.
Right.
Strive towards being more like Jesus. Part of that's understanding what God says in the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's why we aspire to be like Jesus, is because there's a written set of rules, a written set of things we can go, hey, that's good, that's bad, that's malaise, this is competence. Understand what you're trying to move towards. It talks a little bit about that. Leads you to being a masculine man, because you have to be well-rounded, both in your family life, your spiritual life, your work, your practice, your fitness, all the big shebangs.
Yeah, I feel like this has been a really fruitful conversation. Just appreciate you taking the time.
This was fun. I got to enjoy a cigar outside in Tennessee, so thanks for having me.
Awesome. It's just Tom Cruise.
Yeah, it's just Tom Cruise.
Top Gun 3.
This is, dude, I understand why he's in the cockpit. That man's like 4'2", but he's preserved like a pickle. I mean, he's handsome, but man, that's a lot of money.
We love you, Tom.
Yeah,
Tom, if you're listening.
Tom.